In an earlier discussion, we had talked about the expansion of English education. Although the emphasis was on literature, training in English language, but with Western education came the exposure that Indians had to science, philosophy, political theory, Western ideas, etc. Now, the consequence of this new education was also a new class of professionals whose creation, in fact, was one of the objectives of the new educational policy that Macaulay had enunciated. The British needed people to assist them in the governance of the country who would be able to understand the language of the masters better than the ordinary folks. The professionals who were produced by these new education institutions, who joined the services, who took up modern professions like, for example, legal practice, medical practice, who gradually consolidated their social position around the various kinds of legal institutions or educational institutions. These constituted the backbone of the intelligentsia. But the word intelligentsia has, however, a series of other meanings as well. It doesn't merely imply a class of professional people. Professionalization of Indian society was certainly an important development of the 19th century, and with this is associated the development of institutions, development of associations, different kinds of interest groups. But alongside this, you also have the emergence of a critical intelligentsia. And intelligentsia actually implies a set of people who, while being professionals, were also committed to the pursuit of some nobler or broader ideals. The Russians actually used this term intelligentsia in this sense. It did not merely denote a group of professional people. Actually, it also suggested the kind of social and political commitment that such people had actually nursed in their minds. If you go through the Russian literature of the later half of the 19th century, you will invariably run into this kind of a character in Chekhov's writings, in Turgenev's writings. And intelligentsia has also been used by Indian historians in the sense of a group of people whose origins may be located in modern professions, but who had the ability to rise to a higher level of perfection by actually acting as spokesmen of larger interests, by participating in the political processes, in the creation of a modern public sphere in which these institutions and associations began to feature as important elements. One Italian Marxist like Antonio Gramsci used the term organic intellectuals, intellectuals who are not completely distant from the larger society and whose commitment actually enables them to become more kindred to the larger society, to become committed to the concerns of the ordinary people. So if you are actually talking about the intelligentsia, you are going to address the problem at two levels. At the level of modern professions which were emerging at that time, colonial professions for that matter, people came from certain groups who took to education more easily than others and began to play the role of professional classes. And you have the intelligentsia dimension of it, where out of this group of people you have a more committed kinds of intellectuals. When you talk about the modern professions, it's important to think of its various components. Who are these people? What were their role in the pre-colonial times? What happened to people who were in professions in pre-colonial times, in colonial times, in relatively modern times? How would you distinguish between a modern intelligentsia from a pre-modern intelligentsia? These are some of the questions which naturally come up for discussion in any reflection on the state of the intelligentsia.
Sir, what about the nature of the professions in pre-colonial India?
All governments actually need professionals, people who would be able to collect revenue, who would maintain books of accounts and maintain the office. For example, the Kayasthas had been playing the role of accountants and record keepers from an earlier time. You have Brahmins, for example, who are well versed in classical texts, who also played a very critical role in the administration of many of the Indian states, perhaps since ancient times. Kautilya is a great example of a prime minister of the Mauryan Empire because he was so well conversant in the knowledge of governance. So, if you look at the pre-colonial times, you also come across a group of professional people. Iqtidar Alam Khan, the famous historian of the Aligarh School, a professor at Aligarh University, wrote a few decades back a very important essay called On the Middle Classes in Mughal India, where he actually drew attention to the fact that in Mughal India there was a middle class. There were professional people, service people. The existence of this community of professionals can also be identified in pre-colonial times, clustered around the administrative offices of the pre-colonial rulers, practicing as medical practitioners in the urban or rural areas. You have the practitioners of Ayurveda, for example, practitioners of Unani medicine, for example. So depending on the kind of specialization that these medical practitioners had acquired, they also had a certain kind of status in pre-colonial society as medical practitioners. You have teachers. I was talking about the Adams report on an earlier occasion where Adam had listed a large number of teachers who were important purveyors of knowledge at the local level. These were not great intellectuals actually serving in the royal court or the great philosophers who had established their own centers of learning. So maintained their schools and trained up students in classical Sanskrit literature. But at the bottom level, you have small institutions like maktabs disseminating basic knowledge of letters, basic knowledge of arithmetic to the local people. You have local pathshalas, for example. Adams' report actually indicated the kind of institutional structure that the pre-colonial society had in the field of education, in the field of medicine. And such people were professional people, although their position in the modern times would actually change largely because of the growing importance of the English language.
Sir, how would we characterize such professional classes in modern times?
People who were well groomed in Persian language and had acquired the ability to practice in the pre-colonial courts in Mughal Empire, thanks to the knowledge of Persian that they had acquired, would then switch over to English language. Once English became the more widely accepted language, Persian fell into disuse. Persian was no longer used. So you have many such examples of families who are literate in Persian language in order to be able to qualify for positions of judges or practice as pleaders, would then continue to do the same job but specializing in a different language. We have evidence of people even in the latter half of the 19th century. Still Persian was sparingly used as a court language, and we have evidence of how judges were writing their judgment in the Persian language and then putting his signature at the bottom of the judgment in English language. So you see that the increasing use of English from 19th century onwards as the official language made for many of these professional classes the knowledge of English as mandatory in order to be able to practice in the court or in order to be able to teach in the higher institutions of learning. But if you look at the caste composition of such people, you'd see how the three high castes in Bengal, who had already emerged as important service groups in the province, recruited very liberally by Murshid Quli Khan in his administration, would continue to be important in the administrative positions or in the new professions. Let us look at the Chitpavan Brahmins, for example, another very important group of servicemen and professionals in Western India. These Chitpavan Brahmins became important in the course of the late 17th, 18th century as key figures in the Maratha administration. Initially under the Shivaji's Maratha state, during the Peshwa regime, Because of the kind of proximity that they had to the Peshwa, these Chitpravans gradually began to establish their hegemony over the Maratha government centered around Pune in the course of the 18th century. But once English language came as the official language, use of Marathi language became less practiced. These people set up their own institutions at Pune, for example, and then a large number of them moved to Bombay to study in Elphinstone College and Bombay University to become important lawyers or important educationists, important service people, important judges. You have many such names, Ranade, Chiplonkar, Gokhale and many others who would certainly become very important later in the national movement. Think, for example, of the Kashmiri Brahmins in northern India, or the Kastas of northern India, the Kastas of Hyderabad, the Iyer and the Iyengar Brahmins in the Tamil country. Such people belonging to the relatively higher caste had already been service groups, had acquired a certain degree of proficiency as important service families in pre-colonial times, were gradually sailing into this new structure, this created by British rule, by switching over to acquisition of knowledge in English language. But one wouldn't see this story as a very smooth sailing transition, because some people argue, and quite rightly so, that with this new kind of profession that was emerging out of the womb of this new educational system, some of the older professions were also marginalized. In the first place, people who had knowledge of Persian, for example, became less important than people with proficiency in the English language. So one can actually look for a structural change in the professional society of India, along with the fact that with English education, some of the old methods of learning, old systems of knowledge became marginalized. Ayurveda, for example. These local Ayurvedic medicine survived in certain areas, flourished in certain areas, but one can actually make a clear distinction between modern medicine represented by people who had been turned out by the new medical colleges, and Ayurvedic medicine continued to be practiced by these old families who had been specialized in Ayurvedic medicine. You can also see that in course of time, many of these major centers of Sanskritic or Persian learning, centered around some of the great schools of learning in pre-colonial times, also began to languish because of the gradual withdrawal of official patronage. People became more interested in these new schools. The colleges, you can see very important changes in the way cultural patronage evolved in the course of the 19th century. If moneyed men in the early part of the 19th century or in the late 18th century, even in cities like Calcutta, where the impact of the West was more pronounced, had given cultural patronage by way of setting up temples, by way of constructing river ghats, they were also moving into education. They were setting up schools and colleges. Professionalization in the new sense, in the sense of the emergence of new kinds of professions, which could be somewhat identified very clearly, distinctively from old professions, which began to thrive around the new institutions that were emerging. This entire process is associated with what we call the process of institutionalization. New institutions are developing, a more organized system was developing. Instead of dispersed centers of learning functioning through households, you are actually running into a situation where institutions governed by certain set manuals were actually becoming the main purveyors of knowledge, and around these institutions, professions were developing. In the same way, the expansion of the legal system from 1850s onwards enabled the rise of the lawyer class and enabled them to consolidate their position in Indian society more powerfully than in earlier times.
Sir, How did the professionalization of Indian society, in the sense of growing professional opportunities, open its doors for the low caste people?
In other words, you were trying to ask the question regarding the extent to which such opportunities existed for the low caste people. This is, of course, a very important question, but before we come to this, one has to recognize that the people whom we had been considering hitherto came to constitute regional elites. That you have a certain Chitwavan dominance in one region, the dominance of the Hyderabadi castes in one region, the dominance of the castes and the Kashmiri service caste in northern India. These were actually regional elites who continued to prosper or continued to survive even after the Macaulayan dream of depending on such people gave way to the need for the British to cultivate the landowning classes. And one also has to recognize the fact that in many parts of India, particularly in a province like in a region like Bengal, the distinction between land ownership and modern profession was not always very clear. Most of these professional classes had one foot in land and the other foot in professions. But as we come to the rural society, we can see in the caste hierarchy the existence of a certain group of people at the relatively lower levels of the hierarchy. People who belong to the lower caste, who were peasant castes, and unlike the three high service castes who could combine ownership of land with professions, which they had to do in the course of the later half of the 19th century with decreasing income from rent. But below that level, you have a set of people who are rich peasants, people who were becoming wealthy by taking advantage of commercial agriculture, taking advantage of local trade in agricultural goods. Such people were also beginning to acquire ambitions for respectability within this new world of professions. And they found in education one of the ways to get over their disabilities, to come to the urban world and to achieve a certain measure of equality, at least in the professional world. If you are a successful professional, it was less likely that caste debility would actually keep you perpetually in an inferior position. Educational mover, as sociologists describe it, gave some of these castes opportunities for social mobility through participation in modern education, in participation in modern professions. This is not to suggest that people belonging to these intermediary castes, I am not actually talking about the bottommost levels of rural society, bottommost levels of the caste hierarchy. For them to rise up through the educational mover into a higher position in the professional world came much later. But I am talking about these intermediate groups in rural society who had bits and pieces of land but who were participating in agricultural trade and who were actually acquiring in the process some kind of ambition to rise up in social esteem by participating in modern education and modern professions. You have the Namashudros, for example, in Bengal. By the early part of the 20th century, it is possible to identify a small Namashudra elite, people who are taking to English education. The same can be said about a Muslim rural elite emerging out of this class of intermediary peasants who, in the course of the early 20th century, had made a lot of money from commercial production of jute. Ezava caste, Ezavas in South India, for example, an intermediary caste in Kerala, who had suffered from many debilities under the Brahminical orthodoxy, but they were actually taking to modern education, and a small Ezava elite had emerged by the late 19th century to challenge not just the dominance of the higher Hindu caste in the professional world, but challenge them in the social world as well, coming up with their new ideas about temple entry, about the equality between the low caste and the high caste. So, opportunities for participating in modern profession existed, but existed on a limited scale for many of these intermediate castes. Some of the caste groups, thanks to some improvement in their material status, created a small elite or a small Izava elite in Kerala, or a small northern elite in the Tamil country. Everywhere in India, you will find the existence of such groups, small in size, but there are possibilities for them to rise in the professional hierarchy. It is suggested, therefore, that professionalization, if you study it as a sociological process, as a process of social change, actually allow a different kind of mobility happening in a professionalized, institutionalized social order. This has something to do with the creation of the public sphere, creation of associations for that matter, new associations which were enabling the intelligentsia to play a more critical role in social life. We come back to the point with which we had started, the whole discussion about not just professionals, but a critical intelligentsia. Because professionalization would imply not merely to practice in the court, but also to set up their own associations. Bar associations, for example, was one of the earliest such professional associations, which became the foundation for political associations in the provinces. Gradually, we'll see how we know how the Congress organizations in the small towns were very closely linked with these bar associations, which emerged as one of the earliest professional associations in India. Similarly, you will come across professional associations being set up by different professional groups. So you have caste associations on one hand, you have political associations on the other. There may be connections between the caste association and the professional bodies, or connections between political groups and professional bodies, but these are different segments, different components of what was emerging by then as a modern public sphere, characterized by associations, characterized by institutions of a different kind, which were relatively open, which were more accessible, which were under the public scanner instead of those households, where knowledge was disseminated by people to their closest disciples, and even Ayurvedic knowledge remained always within a family. And that was one of the great limitations of traditional practices of medicine. But in the new world of professions, when institutions were theoretically becoming open for everybody to enter and participate, it was becoming a relatively more open society. And this is precisely what we call a professionalized world, a process of professionalization taking place in Indian society during this period. And if knowledge was becoming public, a public sphere was also being created. And associations, the press, the media, printing media, all these were becoming very significant components of the modern public sphere, which is linked with the rise of the critical intelligentsia.
Sir, how far is this theory of organic intellectuals valid, and how did they connect with the ordinary people?
Yeah, that becomes the subject matter of a more radical historiography, which suggests that many of these people were becoming rootless, were becoming completely separated from rural society, and were becoming so urban that the rural people looked upon them as outsiders. So that is the main contention of the subaltern argument, that such people cannot be looked upon as organic intellectuals capable of bridging the difference between the rural and the urban world. But I believe that to say that everyone in this modern professional world was actually becoming completely distant from the rural world or from the world of the peasantry would be an exaggeration. We have many literary characters from Sarath Chandra Chattopadhyay's stories, for example, is an educated person, an urban person who lives in the town but who occasionally goes to the village and communicates information about the modern world to the ordinary villages. So such people also existed, and it was from such people that the critical intelligentsia ultimately emerged in India, who became involved in political activity. He set up political associations, and as we shall see later, they were in a position to take up the cause of the ordinary folks. Their plight was brought to light, their The problems of the peasants and the ordinary people were given great publicity in the journalistic writings, through their political campaigns, and something which we will see when we look at the impact of the critical intelligentsia on Indian journalism in the late 19th century. We have to look at the Indian press, how it evolved in the late 19th century to give opportunities for the critical intelligentsia to come up with radical, ameliorative, and modern ideas.